Okay, let's start. One of the things I noticed last night while doing a test is that this system has a very slow slide things. The slides update very slowly. So sometimes I'll be speaking ahead of the slide. I will try and switch the slide ahead of time. But for instance, when I go, I just click the slide, 1, 2, 3, hang on a second. So here's the next slide for me, 1, 2, 3. See, so it takes about 3 to 4 seconds before you see it. So just understand that. Anyway, so let's start. I'll give you a brief introduction. My name is Neil Mammen. I'm an engineer. I live in Silicon Valley. I've started a few startup companies here. And I'll kind of give you a bit of my background as I go through it. But I started this organization with Kevin McGarry, whose voice you just heard a few minutes ago. It's called Every Black Life Matters, and we'll discuss it. You can see my t-shirt too. It's not the same as Black Lives Matters, Black Lives Matter. It's a different organization. This is the biblical alternative. So let me start with this introduction here. Back in 1918, there was a group of scholars who were Freudian Hegelian Marxists. And they lived in Frankfurt, Germany in the Institute for Social Research. And they were trying to create the ideal socialistic state. But Hitler came along and wanted to create his version of the ideal socialistic state, the real ideal socialistic state. And since they had opposing ideas and Hitler was not one to tolerate opposing ideas, he started to persecute them. They then thought it would be dangerous to remain in Germany. So they finally moved out of there and they ended up in Columbia University in New York in 1935. And it's important that you remember that name, Columbia University, because we're going to hear that a lot today. Okay. Hang on a second, I just want to fix something here. These folks created what is now known as the Frankfurt School in the United States, right? And these are the main members. They wanted to create the ideal socialistic state since they couldn't create it in Germany. They wanted to create it here. So they set out to infiltrate America through the ranks into the lawmakers, government workers, foundation, the arts, news reporting agencies, and various church denominations. Some think there are more communists in the US schools and colleges than in communist countries today. So they were pretty effective at that. And while their infiltration succeeded without much resistance, their effectivity seemed really limited. They were getting into the upper echelons of society, but it wasn't being bought by the average American. It was an uphill battle. The Frankfurt School realized to their dismay that the ideas of it, the goal of achieving a socialist utopia would not work, and most Americans would not embrace socialism or Marxism. They determined, and this is how they figured out, they said, the reason is why Americans are too independent. They're used to a life of freedom. They grew up with independent spirit, you know, the cowboy on the prairie, the man against all odds, right? They wanted, every child felt they would grow up to be their own master. They were raised to be self-reliant, you know, out alone, out there, farmsteading, whatever. And then they were supposed to come out to help others in need. So Americans would not accept a master. So the Frankfurt School determined they had to engage with American kids early, train them from a young age to be dependent on the state, to stop them thinking independently. The only way they sought to achieve this would be to train kids and program them into Marxist principles to a public educational system. This would include not only schools, but of course, colleges. So various fans of the Franklin Institute, like John Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System, set about creating a government doctrine, school indoctrination methodology to raise kids in Marxism from a young age. So John Dewey, father of modern education, longtime member of the American Federation of Teachers, atheist and progressive philosopher. John Dewey has had a tremendous influence on education. He taught at Columbia University. Have you heard that name, right? The same one. The university, you wonder where that influence came from. The University of Michigan and Chicago University. Dewey was a member of many Marxist organizations and a believer and a totalitarian socialist who wanted government to take over all of education via government school. Dewey rejected the traditional religions and moral absolutes, rejected traditional religion and moral absolutes, and is considered the epitome of liberalism by many historians. And you remember this guy because every time you go to the library, you're going to be using his Dewey Decimal Classification System, right? He also co-authored and signed the Humanist Manifesto in 1933. Now, the other conclusion that the Frankfurt School came up with their studies was that corporations in the free market were very influential in the US, and the only way socialism could gain a foothold would be through something that would upset the entire economic system of America, that is revolution. So the first thing they said is we got to have some sort of financial meltdown, and this was the Cloven-Piven strategy. The Cloven-Piven strategy. Now, by the way, it was come out by these two professors, and do you want to know where they were professors at? Yes, at Columbia University, all right? So by increasing, their idea was they would increase the burden of social programs, they could trigger financial instability. Never mind that the very same thing that triggered financial instability was their final solution. Because here's how they would do it. They would, whoops. Somehow there's a, hang on a second. There's an annotating here that I need to get rid of. How do I get rid of that annotating? Annotate. I don't unannotate. Undo. No?
Don't worry about it, Neil. No, we know it's there. We'll overlook
it. Here. Oh, okay, I got it. Okay. So, so they wanted to, I got to get out of the annotating mode now. So the plan was to overburden government systems that welfare, education, healthcare, and law enforcement by reducing employment through over-regulation and increasing the welfare state to the point of social and economic crisis, at which point the nation would be forced to give everyone a basic income from fiat money, artificially printed money, and you get a socialist state. So basic income is one of the goals, and you get there by financially breaking the country. The second thing that they wanted to do is they wanted to have race wars. But race war, they're talking about social unrest, which would allow them to bring about a crisis that they can leverage. In many cases, communism and socialism has entered nations through race war or through civil strife or civil unrest. For instance, in Ethiopia, I grew up in Ethiopia, or I used to go to school in Ethiopia. There was a civil unrest when the North was fighting the South. And in that time, Mengistu Haile Mariam, communists who had nothing to do with the North or the South, took over and made Ethiopia a communist nation for many years. Okay, and the last one was co-opting the church to spread the message of socialism. They determined by co-opting religious dogma to their purposes, they could expand the influence of socialism around the world and neutralize one of the biggest resistive forces to socialism, the church, because the church was the biggest resistance there. And so they came up with something called liberation theology. Liberation theology was a movement in Christian theology developed mainly by Latin American Roman Catholics that emphasized liberation from social, political, economic oppression and as an anticipation of ultimate salvation. Now, the basic fundamentals of liberation theology come from an honest place, as the focus of James' statement in the Bible, James 1:27. Religion that our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So they took this and they corrupted it as a central doctrine of the Bible. So while the gospel talks specifically about salvation through the redemptive work of Christ, Christianity has long spread much of the gospel through outreach, which was led by works of charity. And this charity was generally focused on alleviating sickness and poverty. So most of us is by taking care of the poor. And by the belief that the passage in Galatians 3:28 says that there is neither Gentile or slave nor free, nor there is male or female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus, right? So this is, if you take this and start corrupting this, you get liberation theology. Now, a quick segue for a second. In the last session I talked about it, I play a game with the audience and I asked them, do you have constitutional rights? And most Americans say, yeah, I have constitutional rights. And then I say, well, you know what? The Constitution doesn't give you any rights. Who gives you rights? God gives you rights. In fact, the Constitution is a list of negative rights. Constitutional rights that is taken away, the Constitution is a list of rights that's taken away from the government, right? It's the government can't do this, the government can't do that, the government can't do this, or the government can't restrict your freedom of assembly, right? So it's actually a list of negative rights. The Constitution doesn't give you any rights. Right can only come from where? Well, what does the Declaration of Independence say? The Declaration of Independence says rights can only come from the creator. And what is government for? Government is there to secure those rights. So that to secure those rights, government are instituted amongst men. So governments are there to secure the rights that we all have. Okay, somebody's saying that I need to slow down a bit. I'm sorry, I'm trying to make up for the time we lost, so forgive me. And I also talk really fast. Okay, so long before the Declaration of Independence, in line with that concept of inalienable rights, by virtue of all men being created equal, the Christians, it led to the fight for the freedom of slaves, banning gladiatorial battles, outlawing compulsory prostitution, forbidding the kidnapping of brides, and Christians have been involved in so many of these, what we call fights for inalienable rights. These are not fights for goods or services, but fights for inalienable rights. And these are actual rights. So now the question is, what is a right? So these are what we fought for, but what are rights? I mean, for instance, this is healthcare. So I'm going to play a quick game here with you guys, and I did this with the last group too, so if you've seen it, you'll recognize it. I'm going to flash something on the screen, and you tell me if it's a right or if it's something else. So, and again, there's some trick questions here. So the first one, is this a right or is it something else? Now, most Americans tend to say this is a right, but folks, this is not a right. This is a gun. There is a right associated with that. What is that right? The right to bear arms and gun ownership. That's a right. So you have the right to own a gun, but you're not entitled to be given a gun. You don't have a right to a gun. You have to buy your own gun, right? See the difference? So in other words, you're not entitled for the government to give you a gun, nor are you entitled to neighbors to be forced to buy a gun for you, right? So let's look at this now. Freedom of speech, is that a right? Yes, it is, right? You have the freedom of speech. But what about this, a printing press? If you're young, you don't know what a printing press is. It's what we used to print books on. Anyway, so do you have a right to a printing press? We go, no. Well, you need a printing press to exercise your freedom of speech, right? You should be able to publish newspapers. Yes. But does that mean you're entitled to a printing press? No, the printing press is something else. You see, you have the right to freedom of speech, but you have to buy your own printing press. You have to spend your own money. You are not entitled to be given a printing press. So now you understand where we're going with this. Here's a group of things, and you tell me if they're rights or something else. A home ownership, a job, healthcare, food, clothing, or education. Are these rights or are these something else? Now there's a trick question here because there is a right in there, and most of you think that's something else. There's a right, it's called home ownership. You have a right to buy your own home. You have a right to home ownership, but you have to buy your own home. You don't get to be, you have the freedom to buy a home. You are not entitled to be given a home. Okay, so now you're going, okay, I'm getting the hang of it, but Neil, but there's a few things that aren't clear. Well, let me see if I can clarify that for you. Here's how it works. Rights are things that God gives you, right? Rights are things that God gives you. Don't confuse it with the other thing. The something else is what we call goods and services, right? Goods and services are the product of somebody's labor. Goods and services are the product of somebody's labor. So if a right depends, if you're calling something a right, but it depends on somebody's labor, then it's not a right, it's a good or a service, right? So, for instance, education, is that a right? No, why? Because where are you going to get that education from? Are you going to capture a bunch of teachers and then enslave them and whip them until they give you an education? No, where are you going to get that education from? So how can you assign education as a right? You have a right to buy your own education, but you're not entitled to be given a free education. Now, of course, we can't enslave teachers. So what do? Instead, we enslave the whole population and we take a portion of their income, 30% of their income. So we enslave them for 30% of their life. And then we take that and we pay for the teachers and we pay for a bunch of other things, right? So that's what we've done. We've taken people's goods and services and taken it away from it. And that is not right. Why? Because the minute you have the right to your own goods and services, right? So that's something else's goods and services. And you have a right to your own goods and services. But you don't have a right to somebody else's goods or somebody else's labor. Why? Because that is stealing. Now notice too that constitutions that have a Bill of Rights for education, jobs, healthcare, and homes are all communist and socialistic constitutions. We know how successful they've been. They've gone bankrupt. Why? Because people stop working for things that they can't own. And when they stop working, the communistic state has to get totalitarian and they have to whip them into working harder. And of course, then goods and services go down because what's happening? People are taking too many goods and they're not providing enough. They're not providing enough labor and they're taking too much. So here's the problem. Who should take care of the poor? Right? If this is the case, then who takes care of the poor? Well, the church has to take care of the poor. See, Jesus said, you take care of the poor, not force your neighbor to. In the story of the Good Samaritan doesn't force the innkeeper to pay for anything. He doesn't force the neighbor to pay for anything. He says, I will pay for it. So the church is supposed to take care of them. And the church does a very good job of that and was doing a great job of it. And people say, well, how can the church afford to take care of all the poor? Well, it turns out that in our US budget, we spend about $1.2 trillion to take care of the poor. Well, the church happens to be about 5 to 6 times more efficient. In other words, the church can do something for 15 cents that takes the government $1 to do. And so if you look at that, and we have evidence of that, we can, if you send me email, we can send you evidence of that. But the end result is that we are far more efficient. So that $1.2 trillion that the government spends on us could be replaced with $200 to $300 billion of private charity. Now you go, well, that's a lot of money. Well, not really, because last year private charities, individuals, gave almost $410 billion to charity. We just have to increase our giving by a bit, and we can take care of the entire 1/3 of the U.S. budget. So what about rights, though? Is the gospel, does the Bible care about rights, or is this all some sort of incorrect thought? Well, the Bible is concerned about rights. We don't have to go for that, but we have a list here of all the verses that the Bible talks about rights, and there are a few others too. So, but we should be very careful. While the gospel is concerned about rights, we have to be very careful that we don't change the focus of the gospel. If we replace the gospel of salvation from sin into one that's salvation from oppression, then we are going away from the gospel. If we start fighting to allocate goods like education and food to the poor, rather than having the church do it, then we're going to take away the rights of innocent people. So the government should not be in the process of giving food and service to people. The government should be in the process of what? What the Declaration of Independence say? Secure our rights. Okay, so where did liberation theology go wrong? I mean, so you can see the liberation theology has a good foundation, but where did it go wrong? Well, it might have originally been a good idea, but it was birthed in South American Catholicism. In South America, corrupt dictators worked with corrupt businessmen to oppress the poor and to oppress people groups and keep them under subjugation. So if you recognize this, this is what is called a fascism. Fascism is when the government works with the industry to oppress people. And this is not right-wing doctrine. I'll go, well, that's right-wing. No, it isn't right-wing. Let me tell you why it's right-wing. The reason fascism is not right-wing is because if we look at a history of all the fascists in history, there has never been a fascist in history who was not also a socialist. And you go, really? Yeah, well, remember Hitler? What was Hitler? Hitler was a national socialist. And so he was the most well-known socialist. And then what about Saddam Hussein? Saddam Hussein was a Ba'ath Party socialist. What about Hafez al-Sadat? He was a Muslim socialist of the Ba'ath Party too. How about Jamal Abdel Nasser? He was also a Ba'ath Party socialist. How about Gaddafi? Again, all these were fascist dictators and they were all socialists. Gaddafi, Idi Amin, if you remember him, he was a socialist too. In fact, the very person that we think of when we think of fascism was Mussolini. What was Mussolini? Well, Mussolini was a socialist as well. So we see that socialism and fascism always go hand in hand. In fact, not only was Mussolini a socialist, but guess who else was a socialist? Hitler was a socialist. I mean, not Hitler, Caesar was a socialist. All throughout history. I mean, why is fascism and socialism combined? Why is it always combined? It's combined mainly because kings and dictators can't maintain power unless they promise the masses something, free stuff, right? So Hitler could not have come to power without promising the masses free food or free facilities, free equality and equality. He destroyed the existing unions only to replace them with unions loyal to him. And so we see fascism really is what we call half-baked socialists. And half-baked socialists, governments must go on or cozy up to either boost or bust select ways and means of production and distribution of select goods and select services to society, so that government becomes the most prominent owner and employer, and at the same time, the kingmaker and grim reaper of private sector enterprises. What about democratic socialists? What's a full-fledged socialist? For full-fledged socialists, the difference is that the government must fully own all the ways, on all the means of all the production, all the distribution of goods. So basically, the only difference between fascism and socialism is the government owns the main select ways, and they allow select of their cronies to survive. Okay, why am I going through all this? I'm going through all this because the founder of liberation theology thought that socialism light was in fact capitalism. And so he looked at that capitalism when it never was capitalism, it was just actually socialism. And so they associated liberation theology, said that capitalism was wrong and socialism was right, and it became a draw for Marxists. And the World Council of Churches was adopted liberation theology, right? And the World Council of Churches corrupted that message in a sense, saying Christ came to save sinners from the wrath of God due to their sin. Christ came to save the oppressed people. It changed it from Christ came to save sinners from the wrath of God due to their sin to Christ came to save oppressed people from being under the foot of oppressors. Now, there's nothing wrong with that principle, in principle, that God also cares about our oppression. He absolutely does. But when you take it out of the context and put it into just a gospel of salvation from oppression, that's when you go wrong. So liberation theology was taken up by the World Council of Churches, and the World Council of Churches was led by my uncle. Yes, my father's brother. See, I grew up in a communist family. My dad was a communist. My uncle, who was the head of the World Council of Churches, was a communist. He was also a Christian. You try to figure out how that worked. My dad was a communist, but he was an atheist. Some of my uncles were wanted dead or alive because they were more communist than who was a socialist. That was the Prime Minister of India. At dinners, my cousins would argue about why the Communist Party of India was evil and why they should join the Communist Party Marxist of India, right? Now, to be fair, my uncle did not accept the concept of a corrupt gospel, but he was a communist. But I'm sure that those under him did believe that it should be relegated to oppression and not salvation. Liberation theology shows up in a lot of places. In fact, a lot of books were written about it. And then we got Black liberation theology. Obama attended a church that taught Black liberation theology, was the primary focus of Pastor Jeremiah Wright, and it was codified by this gentleman, James Cone. BLT basically says that Jesus came to liberate the oppressed. Cone says, I was on a mission to transform self-loathing Negro Christians into Black-loving revolutionary disciples of a Black Christ. So over the years, liberation theology diversified and led to critical theory, which has led to critical race theory. And that is the foundation for the movement Black Lives Matters. So critical theory. In sociology and political philosophy, critical theory means the Western Marxist philosophy of the Frankfurt School, there you go, developed in Germany in the 1930s, drawing the ideas of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. Capitalizing critical theory as it was a proper noun stresses the intellectual lineage specific to the Frankfurt School. So if you say critical theory with capitals, that is describing the Frankfurt School's theories. Now, where does this lead us? Well, critical race theory and BLM. We're going to share a video here. I'm hoping it will come through. Let me set it to. So what we're going to watch is the video and the audio doesn't sync on when you do videos. So we're going to show a video of the founders of BLM.
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
So did you catch that? They say we have an ideological framework. We are trained Marxists, right? So and it makes sense, right? the beauty of CRT and BLM is that they could get into the churches by appealing to their compassion. They could achieve some of their long-term goals by pushing CRT, which is basically liberation theology. They wanted to bring this into the churches, right? If they could bring it into the churches, then they would be able to stop that last line of resistance, which was the church. And they could bring America to its knees. And here's the other beauty about it, is they could bring America to their knees by starting a race war, right? And if you could bring, so the idea was, let's get this into the schools through racial education. Let's get into the churches by twisting James's commands of taking care of the poor. And Black Lives Matter and critical race theory has done a very good job of doing this. And it makes sense. I mean, think about it. If you're not a racist, you want to make sure that there is no, if there is a racist element in your life, you want to address it, right? I mean, very few people in America, I've traveled this whole country and I've not run into very many racists. I've run into a few jerks, but I've not run into racists in general. And none of them were in a position to do anything to suppress me or oppress me. So as a Christian, we want to address that. So we're naturally drawn to something that says, hey, we want to stop racism. So a lot of people are well-intentioned. So the problem is it can go overboard. So here's an email, so here's a website that I found. It was actually sent to a church whose former pastor is a friend of mine. I've not had a chance to talk to him about this. He's not there anymore. He's retired since. And I can't imagine he'd be okay with this. But this is a request from the Christian Coalition of Racial Justice to churches in the Portland area. It says, we want to know that you're committed to being an anti-racist church, as is evident by the structural changes that you're willing to make. At the very least, these changes must include anti-racist training for all staff, specifically include elders, bringing in qualified anti-racist speakers to publicly address and teach about racism and the gospel. Recommended speakers include Jamar Tisby, Latasha Morrison, Austin Shannon Brown, and these are all racist critical theory promoters. They had a few more that I couldn't verify were were critical race theory promoters, so I didn't include them on this. And then they say, we want you to start diversifying the church's leadership from the elder board to the worship team and the pastoral team. The elder board should include at least one Black member with anti-racist background who holds actual authority and influence, as to avoid mere tokenization, creating and filling a paid position for chief diversity officer, and the creation of a church diversity committee with open access to church leadership, including diversity and inclusion efforts as long as a standing agenda item for staff meetings. And this, by the way, is the Coalition for RacialJustice.com if you want to go look at it. And actually name the church. I'm not going to do that here. Now, some of you folks might say, well, is this bad? Well, first, all those speakers who push that are pushing race theory, which is anti-biblical. I'll show you in a few minutes. And we'll do an entire session on that one of these days. In fact, if you go to our website, everyblm.org or everyblm.com, we have a whole, and I'll kind of give you a little slide at the end of this that Ken talks about it. And Kevin will talk about that in his next session. Kevin McGarry is my co-founder. So what are the specifics of CRT? I mean, if we're going to talk about it, we better be able to tell you what they teach. So here's the specifics. There is no objective morality. There is no objective truth. Truth is a social construct. They don't say that truth does not exist, but just that only certain people have access to it. Truth is based on how you experience it. And how you experience it depends on if you are part of an oppressed class. Oh, I misspelled your. If you are part of an expressed class or an oppressor class, right? So if you're an oppressor class, that means you're white, and then you experience truth incorrectly. If you're part of an oppressed class, you're Black or brown, then you experience truth correctly. So it's non-objective, right? CRT says all society is split between the oppressed and the oppressor, the power dynamic. The oppressed by virtue of being oppressed are automatically moral. If you're darker skinned, you're more valid because you're part of an oppressed class. Morality is determined by what the oppressed say is moral, not any objective moral value. Your being moral and immoral is solely based on if you're a member of an oppressed class or an oppressor class, okay? Whites are the oppressor class. So you're automatically a racist by being in that class. In other words, it doesn't matter if you really are a racist, by being a white person, you are a racist by fiat, if you will. Not because you act that way, not because you think that way, just because you look that way. Which if you look at is simply racism itself, where a person is judged on the color of their skin, not on the content of their character. And by this reckoning, a black person is more moral than a white person. But there is a caveat. Okay, what's the caveat? The caveat is, and here's a weird twist on CRT. CRT can put you into a de facto racist group based not on your actual color or ethnicity, but if you disagree with CRT. So if you don't agree with CRT, you are white, even though you're really black. So Kevin, my co-founder, who will speak in the next session and is on the line, is considered white and an oppressor class because he disagrees with CRT. So Kevin has been called a white supremacist, right? And people don't see any contradiction of it, even though he's 100% black and he grew up in the projects. So they have an exception to the rule. And the reason I came up with the exception to the rule, because a lot of black people said, wait, this doesn't make sense. I disagree with it. And so they classified them as white and white supremacists. Okay, so what does CRT continue to teach? CRT teaches that racism is everywhere. And because you're white, you don't recognize it. And because you're white and a racist, that's why you don't recognize it. If you say you're blind to color or act like you are blind to race or color, that is, you treat all people equally, you treat all people as equals, this actually perpetuates the power and privileges of the dominant group. Sorry, I have a typo there. If a white person helps a black person, it's only because it helps their own self-interest, not because they really care about that. Critical race theory claims that members of oppressed groups have special access to truth because of their lived experience of oppression. Such insight is unavailable to members of the oppressor group who are blinded by their privilege. So any appeals to objective evidence or reason made by dominant groups are actually bids for institutionalized power. This view is rooted in a standpoint theory, which argues that knowledge is conditioned and determined by social location. By the way, all this came from CRT documents. I'm not making any of this up. I mean, I kind of rephrased it, and I believe I paraphrased it correctly. So this leads to a problem. If you are in an oppressed group, what happens if you are more oppressed than somebody else? So they came up with something called intersectionality. And what do you do if you have two different people from different oppressed classes? What do you do if you're a transgender person and a black person? So they came up with something called intersectionality. This is where you subdivide your oppressed classes further. For instance, a black female has more moral standing than a black man. Black lesbian, because she's black and lesbian, has more moral standing than a black female. A black lesbian handicapped transgender person has even more moral standing than all that. So intersectionality and truth is defined by which class you stand in. So a black transgender handicapped person has more access to truth than a white person or a black person. So with BLM, you'll notice, in fact, if you look at the Black Lives Matter founders, they identify as transgender and they will fight for transgender rights. Why? Because it gives them more power. So in summary, the more oppressed classes you belong to, the more moral standing you have, the more access to truth you have. Okay, why is CRT dangerous? Now, to be fair, not all adherents of CRT agree with all those points. Those are the most common points. Some people say, well, I disagree with this, I disagree with that, but they still adhere to CRT. So you have to be careful. You don't want to typecast everybody. I'm giving you what is the most general principles here. Why is CRT dangerous? Because it's opposed to the civil rights movement. It says that MLK's comment, Martin Luther King's comment of judging based on the content of character versus the color of skin is wrong. CRT says there's no objective morality. Sin is relative to your experience, right? So in other words, that if you're a certain kind of person, then sin is, you could be sinning if you're a white person, but you wouldn't be sinning if you're a black person. Rioting, for instance. If you're a white person and you go destroy a black person's home, it's evil. But if you're a black person rioting to destroy a black person's home, then it's not evil. Or if you're a white person rioting to protect black people or to protest black racism, and then you burn a black person's home, it's not evil. You see these, they're making equivalences here. Okay, CRT divides people instead of uniting them. CRT says that if you are white, you're a de facto racist. But the reality is 99% of white people are not racist. I know this. They don't wake up in the morning and think they're more superior to anyone. I came here 40 years ago, and I can tell you, I've never met a more welcoming culture in my entire travels. I was born in Africa. I grew up in Africa. My parents are from Indian origin. I came here to come to this country, and man, I was like, this is my country. This is the place I want to live. This is the place. This is the kind of person I want to become. I want to become a U.S. citizen. Why? Because they were so welcoming. And I've traveled, you know, and as I said, I've run into people who are racist, but they never really had any control over me. And here's the other thing. There have been more white slaves in the history of the world than there have been black slaves. In fact, the word slave originates from the word Slav, which was what? Slavic people. And they weren't the first slaves in history, but they were the most common slaves at one time that the word slave and Slav was synonymous. Okay, CRT sees color with a caveat. You know, the phrase love sees no color. Well, CRT says it should see color, and that's good. It violates the concept that no male or female, Jew or Gentile, slave or female in God's sight. They're all equal in God's sight. Okay, why is CRT important for us to discuss? Well, because it's infiltrating the church, partly through groups like Black Lives Matter. For instance, here is a speaker at Fuller Theological Seminary talking about CRT, introducing it, talking about different things. She's a well-known author. And her name is Andrea Smith, and she says this. In the book, Decolonizing Salvation, Smith writes, what we presume to be true of the Bible is primarily the result of the history of European interpretation as translated into European languages. We would have a completely different understanding of the Bible if we read it through indigenous languages, translated directly from Greek or Hebrew. According to the Greek positivist grammar of truth, if proposition P is true, then not P must be false. Indigenous epistemologies are not beholden to such logic systems. She's saying, hey, if you're from an indigenous tribe, then this is not true. The proposition P is true, then not P must be false. Now, this logic does not mean logic. Beliefs, even systems of beliefs that seem contradictory to Euro-American cultures, for example, Christianity and indigenous religions can coexist in indigenous culture. What she's saying is that, look, if you're a pagan and you believe in Santeria or something like that, or voodooism or whatever, pagan Hinduism, you can be that and a Christian at the same time. But we know this is completely nonsense. This is completely false. And then she says, they imply that when, not in this passage, but they imply that when we send missionaries to evangelize, we're committing some sort of racial oppression because we think our religion is more superior to their religion. We think that the white man's solution is better than the black man's or the native pygmies solution. And they say they think that they're being coerced into the white man's religion. But let me tell you, this is sheer nonsense. Let me tell you a funny story. As I mentioned, I was born and brought up in Africa, but my parents are very Indian ancestry. When I first met my then girlfriend parents, her dad is the founding pastor of Greater Portland Bible Church. So we have a long history in Portland, even though now I'm in Silicon Valley. He said, you know, I just met him, and he said, so how long has your family been Christian? And my answer, well, actually a lot longer than your family. Why? You see, my family dates our heritage. I didn't explain it nicely. It was just a joke. He laughed. He thought it was really funny. I see, we date our heritage to 51 AD, when St. Thomas came to India and preached the gospel. So our Christianity dates back 1950 years. And England didn't become Christian until 600 years later. So Christianity, the white man's religion, is ludicrous. Africa was one of the first continents to receive the gospel. Remember, Philip meets the Ethiopian, he gets saved. Shortly after, Ethiopia becomes Christian. And until the invasion of North Africa, all of North Africa was Christian. But secondly, isn't it rather racist to think that some poor dark-skinned person like me in India, or some pygmy in the jungle of Africa, or where I was born, is too stupid to decide for himself about the gospel? The very idea that I need some person from America with a degree in sociology and PhD, or on a PhD thesis called something like Indigenous People's Oppression by White Men, to tell me you can choose to accept this gospel if you want to, is racist. I already know that. My ancestors already know that. Do they think we don't have the intelligence to make our own decision? My people don't have the intelligence? That's in a sense of the extreme. You get the information, we'll decide if we want to believe it or not. It's not an American forcing it on. Christianity is not compulsion. You introduce the gospel and you give it to them. If they don't like it, they don't get it. So, but with all this, don't be confused, right? I think it's very important. Racism is evil. Christians have been racist in the past. You can see, we can see that when Christians tried to justify slavery. And ethnocentricity exists. But see, the gospel explains all this. It speaks to all this. One doesn't solve any, it's called sin nature, right? And that we're going to be in constant battle with our sin nature. One doesn't solve any of this by corrupting the gospel, creating racist policies. We should focus on protecting rights, not equalizing results. So the movement BLM is based purely on CRT and Marxism. In the next session in this track, Kevin McGarry will address how you respond to BLM in a way, and a way to respond to BLM, and a way to respond to CRT. You see, it's very hard to respond to a moving target, and CRT and BLM constantly change the goalposts. If you disagree with them, you're a racist. If you agree with them, you have to compromise your Christian principles. And all that ends the conversation right there. We're no further when we started. We may have not had that conversation. No minds have been changed. And those misguided folks will continue to write, or worse, vote us into tyranny under the guise of equality. So what if we could build a bridge? What if we could build a bridge to them where we can meet them in the middle? So there's an ancient art form called Aikido. Not that we practice it or anything, but its principles are very interesting, right? What if we had a pro-life, pro-family, pro-free market, pro-educational choice side that could meet in the middle and go for their own concept? What is it that the people who join, I'm not talking about the founders, I'm talking about the people who embrace CRT and BLM. What do they really want? They don't want racism. They want equality. They want churches to be sensitive to this, right? So what is the Aikido? The Aikido is where you look at somebody's, in the ancient art of Aikido was where if somebody attacked you, if you block them, you've got to have enough strength to block them. And if they're bigger than you, you can't block them. But what if you could take that energy, when they strike you, you take their arm and you move it away from you so you don't get hurt and they don't get hurt. And you can keep doing that with very little effort until they get tired. So the Aikido movement is what we came up with with Every Black Life Matters. And a good example of this, and Kevin will talk about it in the future. Okay. So a good example of this is we ran into some BLM people. They were standing on the side of the road and they were protesting. And we said, do you care that Black Lives Matters? And of course, these BLM people say, of course, Black Lives Matter. So we said, well, do you care that young African Americans don't have fathers in the home because there are social welfare policies chase the father from the home? Does that bother you? I'm like, yeah, it does. Well, so you do care about those Black lives? I said, yeah. I said, well, do you care about the fact that African-American kids have to go to gang-infested schools and they don't have a choice to go to good schools? Do you care about those Black lives? And they're like, yeah, I guess we do care about that. I said, okay, so you care about that. Now let me ask you one more question. Do you care about Black lives of the babies? Do you know that 30% of African-Americans, there would be 30% more African-Americans today if abortion hadn't wiped them out? Do you care about African-American genocide? Do you care that 50 to 51% of all African-American babies are killed in the womb? Do you care about those Black lives? And they go, yeah. I said, well, in that case, you agree with us that every Black life matters. And then I usually give them a badge or something and they put it on. So this is the way you do it, is you meet them in the middle, you look at what are their real goals. So we have, so is there an alternative to sensitivity training for BLM? Yes, there is. We call it Remnant Rising. And you can go to our website, which is everyblm.com, right there at the top. And we'll talk about how to talk about this, how to bring this into your church. It's a program for your church. We come in and we talk about training you. If CRT is coming to your church, this is something we can come in. Every church needs this because CRT is infiltrating the church. And I'm telling you, this will cause more problems in church and will dilute the gospel. So the next session is with Kevin McGarry. And he talks about this, Kevin on the right there, the good looking one. And this is our t-shirt that we hand out. It says real justice from womb to tomb, nuclear family, active fatherhood, free markets, educational choice. And then we have one more that we've added is nonviolence. And the end result basically is that we have a solution, we have an alternative, we have a way to address this and bring it into the church. Thank you. Any questions?
Neil.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say kudos, another great job. Every time, and you and I work together, but every time I hear you talk about CRT, it not only illuminates how manifestly evil it is in conjunction or in comparison to the gospel, but I always continue to learn from you. So I just want to thank you for availing yourself to the Lord to give us a great perspective as to what this is and what it is not. As Neil indicated, I'll be having a session here at 1:45. I'll go further into actual BLM and do a comparison with BLM, a compare and contrast basically between BLM and what we're doing with Every Black Lives Matter. So you get a much more granular look at where we stand, what we stand for, why we stand for that, and how it's important to the mission field. And so I'd encourage you, if you can, to please join us on that. But thanks again, Neil. This is a great job. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other comments? I guess we have some time now because it's lunch break. So I don't think if there are comments, we don't mind staying on a bit longer. And if you're interested in our slides, please send us an email. Here's my email address. And our website is same. Okay, we have a question coming. Why do you think capitalism is more biblical than socialism? Well, so you have to understand that capitalism is not biblical, but what we talk about is what we call morally restrained capitalism. So morally restrained free market. The morally restrained free market says that the government there protects your rights, but capitalism basically says everybody's greedy and they'll do what they want. So what you need is you want to restrain that capitalism. But there's nothing wrong in capitalism. The beauty about capitalism is it's hard to be a capitalist and a racist at the same time. Because let me give you an example. Remember the Woolworths sit-in? What was happening is back in I can't remember the year it was, but these college kids, African-American kids, noticed that they were not allowed to sit at the counter at Woolworths. And so they decided to have a civil disobedience protest in Woolworths. And they went and sat down in Woolworths and they sat at the counter for a few hours, might have been days or so. And they also asked all the Black community to boycott Woolworths. Well, what happened? Within a few days, Woolworths changed their plans and got rid of the whites only counter. Why? Because Woolworths realized that 10% of their income, 10% of their profits, 10% of their sustainability came from the African-American community. It was a very stupid thing to get the African-American community mad at them. Remember, no laws had been passed. That didn't come till much later. I think it was years later the law had passed. And so they realized, hey, this is a stupid thing. See, in capitalism, in fact, in places, I remember looking at a study in Vietnam, health went up in Vietnam when they let the free market in. Why? Because before the government controlled all the sales and of grocery stores and stuff. So nobody cared whether what you got was good or bad and whether you died. But once the grocery stores became independent, and again, I heard this from secondhand, but once the grocery stores became independent, the grocery store owner now cared about his customers coming back to him. So he would make sure that his produce was better than the guy next door and it was healthy. He didn't want his customers dying on him. Before, he didn't care because he got paid rather whether he sold anything or not. So capitalism actually ends up making this huge benefit to society. And it also is the reason why we have electricity. Why do you think we have electricity? Why? Because capitalism, the free market. Edison, I'm reading his biography right now. Just was incentivized with money to go and do these things. But you've got to restrain it. So you need morally restrained capitalism. Somebody asked, how do we get this information to your church? Invite us in. We will fly over and we will speak to you. We'll do these all-day presentations. We do something called Ambassadors of Reconciliation Sunday, where we talk about these issues on a Sunday morning, and then we do a training on the Saturday before. And we've had people come up to us with tears in their eyes, saying, you know, one wonderful friend of mine came up and said, you know, I didn't know any of this. I thought I was a racist. And because I've been told I was a racist by a relative. And when you explained about reconciliation and true biblical reconciliation, it just, I was able to sleep for the first time last night. So a lot of information there. Any more questions? Oh, how well do you think the average American understands about CRT and BLM? Probably very little. And that's why we as the church need to get that message out. And the church, that's the problem. The church is tending to introduce this into the culture and normalizing it. I mean, we have some good friends here. They were out there protesting for BLM. I'm like, do you understand what they stand for? They stand for everything that's causing. I mean, think about it. And I'll leave that for Kevin. Kevin will talk about how BLM actually destroyed the African-American community rather than helps. Kevin, your session starts at 1:45, right?
Yes, 1:45, and this is a great segue. You've left me a little bit to cover beyond now. There's a lot of leeway I have, so this is a great setup for that next conversation. But yeah, 1:45, I'll be on. So,
okay. Any other questions, or shall we? If there are no more questions, again, you can email me. I'm going to leave Kevin's email here as well. So either of us, just contact us. We'll be happy to, and we can get you these presentations as well. Thank you all. We appreciate you taking the time.